When we look at player development, a lot of the time it is pretty easy to go just straight from point A to point B. Consider the entirety of a player at one point and then what they developed into as a whole, both the good and the bad, where they improved, and even how they might decline in some areas to just grasp the full picture of this athlete and everything that they are. But when it comes to development, especially with a quarterback and everything that they have to do, there are a lot of moving parts to get from point A to point B. For example, look at Josh Allen. He steadily improved year after year until he became a truly explosive, great quarterback. And then it was after that he really last year found his footing in his efficiency, limiting his turnovers, and looking as complete as ever. It was one thing to get the explosivity down, but then it took another year or a couple of years to nail down that more mistake free style of football. It doesn't all happen at once. It's gradual. There are traits that come before others. And for Jalen Hurts, your most recent Super Bowl winning quarterback, he seems to do his best when the lights are at their brightest. But once upon a time, that was not the case. This is the story of Jalen Hurts and how he went from a big game faller to a big game riser. Coming out of high school, Jalen Hurts was a 4-star recruit per ESPN, and he would decide to go to the University of Alabama. And of course, the Crimson Tide are such a prestigious university. This is a college that you absolutely associate with football, and not just football, but football excellence. When you go somewhere of that magnitude, there are a lot of expectations for you to perform, and not just gradually, but to immediately make an impact and be a winner. And that's what Jalen Hurts did. As a freshman, he recorded 2,700 yards passing, 23 touchdowns and 9 interceptions, and then on the ground, he had 954 yards and 13 touchdowns. Jalen Hurts looked like the real deal. After that, he continued to play well his sophomore year, and then we get to the 2018 National Championship. At halftime, the Crimson Tide were showing 13 to nothing against the Georgia Bulldogs. And as we established earlier, this is Alabama. The expectation is for you to win. And now, on the biggest stage, Jalen Hurts was not getting it done. As good as he had been to this point, this is a program with a prestigious winning history. And so you get to a situation like this. You're down 2 scores at halftime, and you have failed to put up a single point on the board. More than likely, there's action to be taken, and that's precisely what Alabama did. They would bench Jalen Hurts in favor of Tua, and the Crimson Tide would go on to come back and win that game and become national champions. This was a bittersweet moment for Jalen Hurts. He was now at the pinnacle of college football. He had been leading Alabama all year, and now they had finally become national champions. He had been the starting quarterback for a national championship winning team, but in that big game, he had gotten benched. They could not trust him to get him over the hump. For everything that he had done for him in the biggest game of his career, he just couldn't quite get it done. And after that national championship victory, Tua would claim that starting spot. Jalen Hurts decided to stay at Alabama, and he would spend the next year on the bench, only recording 36 passing attempts. But then, for his senior year, he would transfer to the University of Oklahoma. And this would be the year where, at the collegiate level, Jalen Hurts would not only get back on his feet, his stock would rise higher than it maybe ever was. He threw for 3,850 yards and passed for 32 touchdowns while he was at it. And then on the ground, 1,200 yards and 20 touchdowns. As great as he had been as a young prospect at Alabama, in his senior year, Oklahoma gave him the keys and he ran with it. He finished second to Heisman voting. And going to the NFL draft, he was just outside that top tier quarterbacks. There was Burrow, Herbert, and Tua at the top. And then a little bit below them, you had the likes of Jordan Love and then Jalen Hurts, who would be taken, of course, by the Philadelphia Eagles in the 2020 NFL Draft. This was a decision that was pretty confusing at the time, because when Hurts was drafted, Philadelphia, it seemed like they were still all in on Carson Wentz. It felt as though, yes, he had not gone back to that once near MVP form that he was once at, but it still felt like he was the guy over in Philadelphia. So for them to draft Jalen Hurts in the second round, that was pretty surprising, and we didn't really know what was going on there. To start off his first season, Jalen Hurts would kind of be in that Taysom Hill role. Of course, we saw it in college, we saw it in high school. Jalen Hurts has a lot of ability as a runner, and Philadelphia saw that. So, whilst Carson Wentz was their quarterback, they would put Jalen in at times to get that running attack going, kind of play him in that Taysom Hill role as technically a backup quarterback, but trying to make him develop him more into of a Swiss Army knife. However, those plans didn't work out come the end of that season because Carson Wentz, it felt like maybe Philly's decision to draft Hurts, it felt like it was weighing on him because he wasn't playing like he normally was. And I'm not talking MVP Carson Wentz. We're past that at this point. I'm talking about for every touchdown that Wentz threw, it felt like he was throwing a pick right after. He played the most turnover-prone football of his career, and it felt like for the first time his future was kind of in doubt over in Philadelphia. When Hurts was drafted, it was head-scratching because they had Carson Wentz, but now it felt like they were lucky that they drafted Hurts because they had Carson Wentz. And now there's starting to be calls for Jalen Hurts to come in and take over for Carson Wentz. He obviously had the talent. He was a second round pick. He was second in Heisman voting the year prior. There's something here. And to invest that high of draft stock in him, sooner rather than later, you're going to have to make a decision. On December 6th, he came in and completed or attempted 12 passes. And the following week, he was Philadelphia's starter. In his 4-game start and to close out his rookie year, Hurts would finish with a 1-3 record for just over 1,000 yards, 6 passing touchdowns, 4 interceptions, as well as 350 yards and 3 touchdowns on the ground. It wasn't perfect, and his efficiency really needed to improve with a 52% completion percentage. But now it felt like the tides were turning. The tides were shifting a little bit in favor of Hurts moving forward to be Philadelphia's future quarterback that they could build around. Because not only now had they drafted Hurts, but come the end of the season, they had lost their faith, their trust in Carson Wentz, and they had put Jalen in. In his sophomore season, Jalen looked a lot better, but he was still developing. He threw for 3,100 yards, 16 touchdowns to 9 picks, and on the ground, it was 780 yards and 10 touchdowns. With a 62% completion percentage, he was finally getting to that at least serviceable level. And now he was facing his biggest test yet, because the Philadelphia Eagles were going to the playoffs. They were facing the Tampa Bay Buccaneers in the wild card round, and they lost 31-15. Hurts threw for over 200 yards, 1 touchdown, but 2 interceptions, and he was completing just 53% of his passes. It was not a game to remember for Jalen Hurts, and for everything that had been said about him as a prospect when he was coming to the NFL, obviously, as we saw in the senior year at Oklahoma, the talent was there. But when it came to the biggest games, it felt like there was just something holding him back. And we've seen a lot of quarterbacks go down that path to where they can be great in the regular season. They can be MVP kind of guys in the regular season, but history remembers you most when you win, especially at that quarterback spot. You're the leader of the offense. You're supposed to win. And so it's just a little bit harder to commit to you if you haven't proven that you can show up when it matters most. And so with this playoff loss, there were conversations circling again around Jalen Hurts, around if this was truly Philly's quarterback of the future, if he could be trusted, if they could truly commit to him and benefit from it. Then entering year 3, Jalen Hurts would have his best season yet. In the 15 games he played, the Eagles went 14-1, and he threw for 3,700 yards, 22 touchdowns to 6 picks. Best completion percentage yet of his career at 66%, as well as picking up 760 yards on the ground and 13 touchdowns. And a lot of people forget this, but at the time, when he was healthy, at about week 15, he was the favorite to win the MVP that year, but ultimately he would go down with injuries, and he would return come postseason time for the Philadelphia Eagles. They would make it all the way to the Super Bowl, where they would ultimately lose to the Kansas City Chiefs. And this was the first game where he seemed to really show up in the big moment. On the biggest stage of his career in the Super Bowl, after all the questions about the national championship, about that wild card round loss, finally he showed he had what it took in the biggest moment. Playing against Patrick Mahomes and the Kansas City Chiefs, they lost 38-35. They were keeping up with this dynamic offense, And a major part of that was Jalen Hurts. For everything that he had done in the past, this time it was 304 yards, one touchdown through the air, as well as 15 carries for 70 yards and three touchdowns on the ground. He was finally proving himself, but one defining moment of this game was a fumble that he had. And with the game being so tight, with it coming down to just a 3-point margin of victory for Kansas City, this is a fumble that can really be looked back on and said that, hey, this could have well decided the game. And so, for everything Hurts did right on the big stage, he still failed at just one thing, and that may have cost the Eagles the game. But after year three, expectations were through the roof. Philly just had one of the best seasons in franchise history, and Hurts looked better than ever. And going into year four, it seemed like business as usual to start off the season. Philadelphia, for a long time, they were in the running for the one seed. Not just in the running, they had that one seed locked down for most of the season. But come the end of it, the Eagles, they somehow collapsed, and they would end up having a very unsuccessful end to the year. And come playoff time, they would lose in the wild card round 9-32 to the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. For everything that had been done the year prior, for all the expectations that they had that were through the roof, it seemed like they were on the up. All of a sudden, it just came crashing down at the tail end of that 2024 season, or 2023-24 season. And now questions were coming. They were coming again. What was the reason this offense, when it matters most, they just could not get it done? But then came the 2024-25 NFL season. And for the Philadelphia Eagles, there were a lot of question marks about them coming into this year. After what had just happened last year, after the collapse that they had, did they have what it took? Did they have what it takes to get back to that Super Bowl level? Or would it be more like what we saw from them at the end of the last season, where their defense was letting them down, their offense was not maintaining pace, but they had one new addition. They had Saquon Barkley, and they would start the year off. It seemed like it was going to be a continuation of the year prior, of the end of the year prior, in which they weren't playing too well. They started off 2-2, but after that they had a Week 5 bye, and ever since then, the Philadelphia Eagles were practically unstoppable. From their bye week onward, in games where Jalen Hurts started and finished the game, they never lost. Saquon Barkley ran for 2,000 yards. That offense looked incredible. But the biggest test for them would come in the postseason. Because for everything they had done, it had not yet been forgotten the collapse of the year prior, the loss in the Super Bowl the year before that. Philadelphia was not going to be happy until the Eagles finally got over that hump. They finally won. And that's what they did. Philadelphia, they were entering a Super Bowl rematch with the Kansas City Chiefs, the team that they had taken to their limit just a couple years ago. The Chiefs, though, this time around, they were looking to three-peat. They had won that first one against Philly. They had won the year after. They were coming for ring number 3, back to back to back. But the Eagles, for every question that was had about them, they finally put it all together. And the Super Bowl MVP was Jalen Hurts, who finally got it done. Played one of the best games of his career on the biggest stage of his career against a Chiefs team that everybody expected to three-peat, everybody expected to win because it would be unprecedented. Nobody had done it before, but the way the Chiefs dynasty was looking, it seemed possible. But the Philadelphia Eagles won, and they won thoroughly. And at the center of it all was the Super Bowl MVP, Jalen Hurts, finally rising from this big game faller over Alabama, getting benched in the national championship, to coming into the NFL, and then the sophomore season having a bad showing in the wild card round, to then year 3, seemingly putting it all together, having an incredible, one of the best Super Bowl performances of all time, but having that one fumble that could have cost him the game. Then the collapse in year 4, but finally, in year 5, he had not only taken the Eagles to the Super Bowl, but brought them to victory. And he had won Super Bowl MVP in the process, finally, truly, undeniably rising in the biggest game of his career, on the biggest stage of his career, and flipping their narrative away from someone who consistently falls into big games to someone who can rise. And that is how Philadelphia Eagles quarterback Jalen Hurts went from getting benched in the national championship at Alabama to becoming a vital piece on a Super Bowl winning Philadelphia Eagles squad.